How many of you guys are grateful that God has redefined even our past? How beautiful of a thing is that? Come on now. Even your past has been redefined by the work of Jesus. Come on now. I mean, you see, the moment the present moment passes and it becomes a part of the past, it ceases to be reliable because your memory is horrible. You're a beautiful person, but your memory is not good, and neither is mine. And I remember when my wife and I first got married, and we had the U-Haul. I was too young to drive the U-Haul myself because I was just 2 weeks 19. So my dad was driving the U-Haul for me down to Florida as we moved, and I was following behind in my Buick Skylark. And my wife's car was on a trailer being towed behind the U-Haul, and we followed them all the way there. And I remember looking at her side view mirror on my wife's car that was being towed, and I said, "Hey, do you remember when your side view mirror got smashed and you covered it in tinfoil to make it look as though there was still a mirror there, even though there wasn't?" And because in my mind, I remembered that happening. And she said, "That never happened." And I'm like, "I'm not asking you if it happened. It happened. I'm just asking you, hey, do you remember that? That was funny." End of story. She was like, "That did not happen, Jeff." I'm like, "It happened." And we were only married 2 weeks. We have our first big fight over this, over tinfoil on a side view mirror. And finally, we argue for quite a while about this. And I get so adamant. I'm like, "I swear on my love for you that you broke your mirror and you covered it in tinfoil." And so we stop at the next exit, and I talk to my parents. I'm like, "Do you remember when she put tinfoil on her mirror?" And she was like, "That was your brother-in-law's car, Jeff, not your wife's." But in my mind, I saw it so perfectly. I could remember when it happened. I could remember what it looked like, but it wasn't true. It was a false memory. But I believed it was true, and so I even reconstructed that scene in my mind, and it seemed so real. Now, that's just a silly example. But it seemed so real to me, but it was so utterly and completely false. Now, we have false memories about other things, especially pertaining to our weaknesses and our faults and our frailties and areas where we failed in the past. And most of you, the past that you remember is much worse than the past that actually was. And you believe you're much worse, or you were much worse than you actually were. And the thing is, when you rehearse the past, your brain doesn't understand if it's actually reliving the event or if you're just thinking about it. Musicians who think about playing instruments, their brains react the same way they react when they're actually playing the instrument. And that happens in all sorts of other things. And when you sit there and you rehearse your past and you remember it, your brain simply thinks you're living through that event again. And when you've made it worse than it actually was because you have false memories, what are you constantly doing to yourself? You are constantly time traveling back to a past that never even happened. And you're putting yourself through the trauma of those events that never were. But aren't you glad that Jesus has redefined even our past? His I amness has swallowed up everything about me. And that's beautiful. Anyways, that's not really what I want to talk about, but that was just something beautiful to talk about. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 10, okay? Are you guys there yet? Just giving you a few minutes to get there in case you don't know where Hebrews is. Open up with a little story just to give you time to flip. Okay, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 through 10. I'm going to talk to you this morning a little bit about the cross. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the atonement. We're not going to get really deep into anything, but we're going to talk about what the death of Christ accomplished. And even more importantly than what it did accomplish is sometimes we have to begin at the very beginning, and we have to establish what it did not accomplish. And that's just as important as what it did accomplish. Because we have made the death of Christ into something that it is not and never has been. And we've made the cross into something that God never intended for it to be. And so sometimes in order to actually even understand what the cross was all about, it's just as important to discover what it's not about. So we are going to talk a little bit this morning about what the cross is not about and what it is about. So Hebrews chapter 10, before I read that, let me tell you a little story. I remember when I was about, 8, 9, 10 something years old. Memory's bad, but it was way back there. And my friends and I were playing outdoors, and one of our favorite activities was scouring the forests for dead trees. because you can kick them down really easily, and it can make you as a little boy feel like the Incredible Hulk. You know what I'm saying? Anybody ever do that? You find them with no tops and they're all rotten and you can just kick it down. And we were going through the woods one day. We had our BB guns and we were just being boys, and we saw this monstrous sequoia of a dead tree. And we all wanted a piece of that action because it was huge. And we knew that knocking that down would make us, as young boys, feel very powerful. And so we all raced for it, but my friend Travis gets there first. And I tell this story in my book, but I call him by a different name to protect his identity. So if you read it and you're like, oh, you call them a different name. No, this story actually happened. I'm not making it up. I just changed his name. And he runs at it, and he kicks it with a mighty kick, and poof, the tree falls down, crumbles into pieces, and yay. But then all of a sudden, bees start flying out of the tree. Because it had also become a home for a family of yellow jackets. And they became very angry when their home was toppled. And so my friend just starts screaming. And at first we didn't see the bees. We didn't know what was going on. He just starts slapping himself and screaming. And so we think he's lost his mind, that the rush of power from toppling that tree has just fried his circuits and he's gone mad with power. He's just slapping himself and screaming like, what's going on? And then we realize he's getting stung by bees. And if we don't get the heck out of there, we're going to be stung by bees too. So we all start running, screaming, my friend slapping himself, and we're all going with this to try to avoid being stung. And he runs in the front door of his house, the screen door slams, and my other friend and I were just standing outside. It all just happened so fast, so we're just like, what's going on? One minute we're kicking down dead trees, the next minute our friend's slapping himself and getting attacked, and it's just whatever. All of a sudden, from within the house, we start hearing his dad's booming voice, just, what's going on? And then all of a sudden, we start hearing, smack, smack, smack. And my friend screaming and wailing and howling and crying. And to our young minds, the only thing we could think that was happening was that his father was angry because he had brought a bunch of bees in the house. And so his father was beating the snot out of him. That was what we thought was happening. Now, of course, if we would have stopped and processed it a little bit more, we could have figured out what was actually occurring. But just in that moment, we were like, he's killing Travis. And we just kind of looked at each other and we're like, what is going on? And then after a while, we began to put two and two together, and we realized, oh, his dad is not killing him. His dad is killing the bees that are trying to kill his son. His dad is saving his son. His dad is doing something heroic, and actually in the process of saving his son from this swarm of angry bees, the father got stung a whole bunch himself. So at great cost to himself, he saved his son from something that was destroying him. But we stood outside, not having a clear picture, and we misunderstood the event. And we saw it as a father punishing his child for something that really was no fault of his. And that's how we perceived it. And it made his father look like a monster to us. We used to love going over to Travis's house. We loved his dad. He was like a black belt in Taekwondo or something. He was cool. But now all of a sudden he's a monster. And I don't want to go to Travis's house anymore because this is how he treats his son when he's in trouble. And it changed our view of his father for a moment. And then our view of his father was redeemed when we realized what he was not doing and what he actually was doing. Now, there is a view and there is an understanding of the cross called the Penal Substitution theory of the Atonement. It's known by other names as well. And it's very popular even amongst gracers, amongst grace people. Because what we have to do is we have to prove that God is not angry. But we don't know how to deal with the angry God passages of Scripture. And so we come up with a solution. The passages of Scripture that make God out to look angry are scriptures talking about God before Jesus gave him his atoning antidepressant and chased his blues away and turned his frown upside down. And so the angry God scriptures are true. They're just not true anymore because Jesus changed his father. Jesus reset him back to his factory settings, and now he's a nice guy again who can love his creation instead of loathing his creation. And so Jesus takes the sin of the world upon himself, and the Father looks at Jesus, and instead of seeing his beautiful and perfect Son, he sees you and me in our disobedient states. And the Father pours out his fiery wrath and vengeance on his Son. And the Son drinks the cup of the Father's wrath down to the very last drop. And then the Father's all of a sudden like, oh, no more wrath left. I guess I can love the rest of y'all because I drained my wrath on one. And that's called the penal substitution theory of the atonement, and it's very popular, and it's very popular amongst grace folks. Why? Because we have to prove that God is not angry, but the only way we know to do that is to show that somehow God's wrath gland got surgically removed through the cross. And so then we can say, well, what about Sodom and Gomorrah? What about Noah's flood? What about this, that, or the other? We're like, well, that was before the cross. Because before the cross, God was angry. He was really tightly wound and he was mad. But after the cross, he is in a permanent good mood because he's poured out all of his wrath. Like the story I told you last night, the drunken father beats up big brother so that Junior can be let off the hook. And that's how the cross is preached. And we think such a message is attractive. I've heard from missionaries who have said, if that's what the gospel is, then the gospel does not work in the country where I work, because that message is an abomination to the people I work with. They don't see love in that. Their justice system doesn't work the way the American justice system works, so they don't see things that way where you can just say, well, you owed a debt, you were on death row and someone came in and said, I'll take his place. And so that doesn't make any sense to them. So the gospel becomes senseless in certain nations and in certain cultures where they don't understand that kind of a concept. It cannot be the gospel if it doesn't work everywhere. Right? Right? But in our American arrogance, we think it only has to work here. But most of the stuff that we preach in America only works here. I always find it interesting that when we talk about last days type of stuff, eschatology, the bleak future we're looking forward to is what everyday life looks like for most of Earth's inhabitants. But we think when it comes to America, that means we're in the last days. Again, that's kind of the arrogance of America. Anyways, I'm going off here. I'm having too much fun. So sometimes, slaying sacred cows, tipping them, and then roasting them is just too much fun. But anyways, let's get back to the cross. Let's get back to the atonement here. But that's the way we've preached the cross. That's the way we've preached the atonement for years. And that very message has crept into grace circles. And for some, it's what their whole understanding of grace is built upon. Because the reason God is not mad is because he poured out his anger on the Son so that he can pour out his love on you. But does the Scripture actually teach this view? Is that actually the God? Because remember, the Bible tells us that Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. He is the radiance of his glory. He's the image of the invisible God. So if Jesus reveals here a wrathful, that's who God is. Then God is an angry and retributive monster. And even if he's in a good mood now, there was a time when he was a genocidal, tyrannical maniac who was fine with slavery, who was fine with infanticide, who was fine with genocide. But now, because one guy was spiked to a cross, everything has changed. I'm sorry, but even if that were true, I will not worship such a God. Because even if he's in a good mood now, he's twisted in the core of his being. And I cannot raise my hands and sing how great is our God with that monster in mind. I'm sorry, I just can't. And most of the people we rub shoulders with on a daily basis who are not believers can't either. And that's why the gospel that we preach, even when we use words like grace, does not appeal to them. Because at the core of our message is a God who cannot love us unless he murders someone else. And that is not love. That is warped human justice. All right, let's get going here. I got to read some scriptures so you know I'm a Christian. So Hebrews 10, 5 through 10. And this is a bit of commentary by the writer on Psalms 50, 6 through 8 are quoted directly, which is the words of the pre-incarnate Christ, and he speaks about sacrifice and offering and how God views sacrifice and offering. It says, therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Okay, now in the penal substitution view of the atonement, Jesus is the sacrifice that appeases the wrath and the anger of God. God is universally mad at all human beings because one guy ate a piece of produce that a talking snake said would make him godlike. And because that happened in a garden somewhere in the Middle East, God became universally angry at all men and had nothing for you but wrath and hellfire and brimstone. And his brilliant solution to his own problem was to become a man and sacrifice himself to satisfy himself. And all of a sudden it starts not making a whole lot of sense. But that's the way we've taught it. God was angry at the human race, and so he needed a sacrifice. And so throughout the Old Testament, these animal sacrifices sort of held him over. They were like the hors d'oeuvres that he served to himself before the main course. And he's like, man, I want something more than this, but a bull will do right now. I want a steak, but I'll take the mozzarella sticks, And so all these animal sacrifices that were prescribed by the Mosaic law are sort of just hors d'oeuvres that are kind of holding his anger at bay. And then we say Jesus comes, though, and then he is the ultimate sacrifice. He is the main course. Just when God is about ready to storm the kitchen and demand that his meal be brought to him because he's had it with the leftovers, or the hors d'oeuvres, rather, all of a sudden, Jesus comes out of the kitchen and he serves the Father up a steaming plate of himself. And the Father eats, burps, wipes his mouth and says, "Woo! That was good." And then everything changes. And now, you, me, and God are buddies. But is that the way that the Bible talks about sacrifice? Is that the way that Jesus and the apostles talked about sacrifice? No, it's not. And it's important that we understand this. All right, I'm trying to have a little bit of fun up here. And I'm also very tired. So when I'm tired, I get delirious and I say weird stuff. But that always makes it interesting. Let's read again. Let's start in verse 5. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire. So did God ever desire sacrifices and offerings of a bloody cultic kind? Did he ever desire such things? Not according to Jesus. Not according to Jesus, who is speaking even under the old covenant, the pre-incarnate Christ, speaking through the psalmist, saying, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, even when they're in an era where they are still regularly being offered. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. Now that's where we usually stop and say, well, God did not desire the sacrifices and the offerings of animals. But he did desire the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ. And therefore, when it says sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, it's talking about the animal sacrifices. But the body prepared for the Son was the one sacrifice that God did desire. See, he's not satisfied with animal sacrifices. It's a human sacrifice he really wants. And have you ever actually stopped and thought about the fact that to most people, Christianity looks like a cult of human sacrifice? We don't think about that because we're so used to it. The ubiquity of this, we don't see it that way. But to an atheist looking in, they're like, you are adhering to some weird, warped, ancient, antiquated belief system that is based on human sacrifice. If Jesus was a sacrifice of the same order as the animal sacrifices, he was just a supersized version, then our religion is based on a God who accepts human sacrifice. And he's no better than the gods of Babylon. He's no better than the gods of Ur. He's no better than the gods of antiquity. All right now. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. So we'll get to that, a body you prepared for me part in just a minute. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. So when that smoke of that animal who'd had its throat slit and its body set on fire, when that smoke rose to the sky, the ancients believed God was breathing it in and getting all hopped up on it. And just enjoying that smell of burning animal. But Jesus, through the psalmist, tells us God was not into this. Even while it's still being done, God was not into this. He was not interested. Then I said, here I am. Who's I am here? Here I am, Jesus. Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God. So the whole idea of a body you prepared for me and I've come to do your will are connected, right? First he said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you didn't desire, nor were you pleased with them, even though they were offered in accordance with the law. Did you hear that? Even though these things were offered in accordance with the law, the pre-incarnate Christ says, God was never really into this. And he was never interested in this. And therefore to say Jesus' sacrifice is an amped up version of that would be so warped and twisted. If God didn't desire that, and here Jesus is telling us this, then why would he want a human sacrifice if he didn't want the animal sacrifices? Let's keep reading. Even though they were offered in accordance with the law, then he, Jesus, says, "Here I am, I have come to do your will." He sets aside the first in order to establish the second. And by that will, what will? The will that Jesus said he had come in the world to do. By that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Now here, the body that was prepared for Jesus is called the sacrifice. But is it a sacrifice in the order of the bloody cultic sacrifices offered under the Old Testament? No, because the writer says he sets aside the first. What's the first? That old order of sacrifice prescribed by the law. He sets aside the first in order to establish the second. What is the second? The second is the will of God that he came to accomplish in his body. And what is that will? By that will we have been cleansed through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. In other words, what Jesus accomplishes is not that he offers something to God that finally makes him happy. What Jesus does is that through his death, he saves us. He does something in us changes. Okay? Something changes on our end, not on God's end. The will that Jesus came to accomplish was that he came to transform humanity, not to transform deity. He sets aside the first, that old violent sacrificial system, in order to establish the second. And the second was the will of God. And so he uncouples the will of God from a system of violent sacrifice. He uncouples the two so as to say these were never the will of God, ever. Even though they were offered in accordance with the law, they were not the will of God. Now that will mess with your understanding of a lot of things, starting with the Bible, which is kind of important as a Christian. It'll mess with your understanding of the Bible because we are unable to see the Bible as being anything but a perfect dictation of God to men. And every little stroke of the pen, every period, every comma is divinely inspired. Even the scribal errors are somehow divinely inspired. It don't matter. It has to all be this perfect book written by one author. But the Bible is not such a book. The Bible is a library of books. If you go into the science section of the library, you're going to have stuff by Newton, you're going to have stuff by Stephen Hawking. You read their works, they're not going to agree on everything. Why? Because Newton writes in one era of history, Stephen Hawking writes in another era of history. Things were discovered between those two guys, okay? Now some of this is irrelevant. It's not unimportant, it's just irrelevant, but it's still important because it led to this. So you don't just throw it all away. You don't throw away the stuff that doesn't agree with what we now know to be true. You understand it as pivotal in bringing us to where we are now. It's still important. You don't toss it out and burn it, but you keep it in its place and you see it for what it is. And we have to start understanding the Bible as being a library of books written by many different authors, many different times in human history, where, you start in the understanding, the Judaism in the Pentateuch is completely different from the Judaism that was being practiced in the days of Jesus. Yeah. As different as Pentecostal Christianity is from Roman Catholicism. Okay? They're both brands of Christianity, and they both use the same sacred texts, but they're completely different. Right? Yeah. And so the Judaism you have through Moses is completely different from the Judaism that's taking place in the days of Jesus. Completely different. You've got to understand that and understand how mindsets change and how understandings change and how language changes. You can't just open it up and think everything is just going to be 100%, it's all just going to tie together perfectly, because that's not the way the Bible was written. That's not the kind of book it is. It's not a book. It's a library of books written by many different authors. And so when we read about sacrifices and offerings and all these things, we think we're reading, this is God's perfect will. This is what he always wanted. He loves the blood. He loves the gore. He loves that kind of stuff. He just gets off on watching animals that he created die horrible, miserable deaths and then being burned. He loves it. And we think that must be the perfect will of God because it's in the Scripture. We don't understand what Jesus says in John 1:17 and 18. The law came through Moses. Okay? But grace and truth through Jesus Christ. What is that grace and truth that comes through Jesus Christ? Verse 18, no one has ever seen God. But the one and only Son who lives in his embrace, he's made him known perfectly. So the Father revealed through Jesus is the Father as he really is. The Father revealed through Moses is the Father as Moses understood him. But not the Father as he really was. Jews themselves say that the reason God allowed animal sacrifice to go on was that he was weaning humanity off of human sacrifice. And he chose one group and he implemented animal sacrifice to get them to stop killing each other. And then ultimately brought the whole system to an end, and now it is. Okay? But even the Jews themselves acknowledge that sacrifice was not God's ultimate will. It was God keeping them from doing more harm and violence to one another. But he couldn't just throw away the system altogether because it was so common in the ancient world. And God knows how to speak the language of men. Right? God will meet you at the pool of Bethesda when you're waiting for an angel to come and stir the waters. That's mythology. That never happened. There wasn't an angel that came down and stirred the waters. Okay, there was a spring that bubbled up that they mistook as being an angel. That was mythology. But yet God came and met a man there who was crippled in the midst of his own mythology. God will come and commune with you in the midst of your messed up beliefs. Yeah. And he did just that to us. He came to the human race when we were a violent race, sacrificing, shedding blood, thinking that we were making God happy. And he spoke to us in our language, and he took us through this process. You know, there's actually verses in the Old Testament itself where it seems to be suggested that human sacrifice was even a practice at one time amongst Jews. Okay? But then the animal sacrificial system becomes implemented, and we get slowly educated and weaned off that until ultimately it's done away with altogether. But my point in saying all this to you is that we have this understanding that God is this angry, violent God. He wants animal blood. He wants sacrifices. But after a while, he says, that's not cutting it anymore. I need something bigger and I need something better. So, son, you're going to have to go down and become a human being, and you're going to have to live a perfect life because I need an unblemished lamb to be offered to me. And then you're going to offer yourself to me as a cultic sacrifice, and I am going to be satisfied. And then those who pray the prayer and walk the green mile to the altar can be saved. What a brilliant plan we've come up with! And you know, when you say it like that, you realize how non-brilliant it really was and really is. But when you hide such foolishness behind lofty theological language, it looks like it's something. And we have to hide the nonsense of the message we preach behind these lofty theological terms. But when you pull those things away, you see it for what it really is. If I can't go to a third world country and preach this and then be moved by the love of God, then it's not the gospel. If I can't talk to my kids about it and tell it to them simply, it's not the gospel. Come on now. All right. Anyways, what the writer of Hebrews is telling us is that God was never that way. God was never into such things. He was never into violence and blood. That's not the way he is. That's not the way he works. Jesus uncouples the will of God from the whole idea of violent sacrificial appeasement. He says they're two very separate things. What I came to accomplish, the sacrifice that I came to offer, is not a sacrifice like you think of sacrifices. Yes, it can be called sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice the way that the human race has interpreted sacrifice. Now remember that, and we'll come back to it in a moment. Okay, let's go to Deuteronomy. No, you go to Psalms chapter 50. Let's go to verse 7, Psalms 50, verse 7, and I'll just quote you from Deuteronomy 32, 37 to 38. God will say, "Where are their gods, the rock they took refuge in, the gods who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up to help you. Let them give you shelter." God speaks of the sacrifices offered by pagan nations to their pagan gods as being sacrifices in which those offering the sacrifice believed that the god was feasting on the meal offered to them. He was drinking the blood and eating the meat, and when you burned it, he was breathing in the smoke and enjoying it. That is a pagan view of sacrifice. That's the way the pagan nations did it. That's what sacrifice was. Okay, now in Psalms 57 through 16, remember that it's important because sacrifice was something you offer the gods to change something in them, to make them more favorably disposed towards you so that they'll bless your crops and open the heavens and send rain on you and bless your kids and make your wife's womb fertile, and that's what you do to get the gods to act. You offer them blood, you burn animals, and boom. Just a coin in the vending machine, out comes a blessing. Right? Psalms 57 through 16, I think I'll read. It says, "Listen, my people," God says, "and I will speak, and I will testify against you. Israel, I am God, your God, and I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me." So there's a sense in which God says, I speak your language, I understand that's how you do things, and for a season, I'll take it as worship, and I'll take it as an expression of your love, because I can speak your language. Verse 9, "But I have no need of a bull from your stall, or of goats from your pens." Thanks for offering them. I know you do it from a good heart. I'll speak your language, but know that I don't need any of this. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. We always quote that to talk about the fact that God can give you a new car and bless you, and that's fine and dandy. But what he's actually saying was, if I was into drinking animal blood, then I could be popping straws and cows and draining them like Capri Suns all over the planet because I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. If I was hungry one day, I was like, man, I need some cow blood. There's one. Oh, I need another. That stuff is good. He's like, dude, if I wanted animal blood, I could get it at any time. I don't need you to bring me something. I don't need you to slay some animal and throw a plate of meat behind a curtain and feed me a snack. He's like, I speak your language, and so I understand you're doing this out of a good heart. So your sacrifices are before me in that sense because I know your heart. But no, I don't need this. And no, I'm not really into this. It's not really who I am. It's who you are. And so I'll work with it for now. But it's not who I am. I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world is mine, and all that is in it. Do I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? Sacrifice your thank offerings to God. Fulfill vows to the Most High, and call on him in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. But to the wicked person, God says, what right have you to recite my laws or take my covenant on your lips? You hate my instruction. You cast my words behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him. You throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth, my iPad went off here. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother and slander your own mother's son. When you did these things and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you. But now I arraign you and set my accusations before you. Okay, break this down real easily here. Israel is behaving just like the pagan nations. They think they can do what they want to one another. They can do what they want to each other. They can treat each other hatefully and spitefully and use other people and throw in their lots with thieves and speak evil against one another. But as long as there's a little blood on the altar, everything's okay because that's all the gods really want. It's not really about me and you and how I treat you and who I am towards humanity. It's about making sure I'm giving God his antidepressant so he doesn't kill me. And so he blesses my field. And so here's some animal blood. Here's a sacrifice. Here's this. Here's that. Here's the other. Doesn't matter what I do. Doesn't matter how I treat humanity. All that matters is that I'm giving God his daily portion of animal blood. And God says, you're missing it. I'm not like you. That's not the way this thing works. If I was really into eating animals, you'd be finding, crunched up cow bodies all over the place. And because I could do it if I wanted it. You think you can do what you want to humanity and offer me some blood and everything's fine and dandy, but I'm not like you. That's not the way I work. But see, we've got this twisted image of God where what he wants is the blood and the violence, and then we can do whatever we want as long as he has that. And you can see how we've even taken that pagan view of sacrifice and we've brought it right into Christianity. Because our very definition of grace is that because the ultimate Mac Daddy supersized sacrifice has been offered, now it doesn't matter how I treat you. It doesn't matter how I treat my wife. God, the ultimate sacrifice has been offered. And so how I treat humanity, it doesn't matter because God's violence has been appeased through the sacrifice of Jesus. And so it doesn't matter what I do to you or how I am towards you or how I act towards the body, how I act towards that's not the stuff that matters. What matters is that God got his blood and now we're cool. That's a pagan view that God rebukes Israel for that we've brought right into Christianity and we call it the gospel. Come on now. All right, let's keep going here. Let's have a little more fun with sacrifice. Isaiah 1:11, God says, the multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. Did God have any pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats? No. Did it satisfy anything in him that was lacking? No. Did it make him happy? Did it make him bless them? And no, it did nothing to him. He says, I have no pleasure in this stuff. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? I have more than enough burnt offerings. I'm not into this. But the law prescribes them. And here's God saying, I don't need them and I don't want them and I take no pleasure in them. Well, what's the context in this passage? Read on a little bit. Fast forward to verses 16 and 17. And God says, wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless and plead the case of the widow. Again, they weren't caring for humanity, but they were trying to care for God by offering him blood sacrifices. And they were behaving just like the pagans. Doesn't matter what I do to you, doesn't matter how I treat the oppressed, doesn't matter how I treat the orphans and the widows, as long as God's got his blood, we're cool. God says, nope, you're missing it. That's not who I am, and that's not how I work. That's how the pagan nations work. That's how their gods operate. But that's not who I am. I know you got Leviticus, and I know you got this big, intricate rule book of how to offer sacrifices and when to offer sacrifices and how to do it and when to do it and what to wear while you're doing it and what to think about while you're doing it, just so you get everything. I know you've got that book, but let me tell you something a few years down the road, a few years later, now that you've hopefully matured a little bit in your understanding, that's not the way things really work. What I care about is how you treat each other, how you see humanity. I don't need blood. I don't need lambs and goats. That's not who I am. That's not how I work. You see, every time there's an anti-sacrificial statement in the Old Testament scriptures, there will always be a comment about how Israel was treating the oppressed somewhere in there. All right, let's look at a few more. Isaiah, you know what? We've already read Isaiah. Let's go to Ezekiel 16. No, you know what? Let me read you from Isaiah. Did I read you from Isaiah? Yeah, we just did Isaiah 1:11, didn't we? Okay, you know what? Go to verse 10 in Isaiah chapter 1. Right before God says, the multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? Look what he says in verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Who's he talking to? Israel. He calls them Sodom and Gomorrah. Israel. Why? Well, we think Sodom and Gomorrah, all we think is gay. God fried them all because they were gay. You won't find that in the text. You won't find that there. We've read it into that because that's what we see. We hate something, and so we've got to see the things we hate in a text, so it gives us justification for acting a way that we want to act. But the text itself doesn't say that's why God did what he did or why whatever the story says. That's not why it says that happened. But that's what we think of when we hear Sodom and Gomorrah. But what was the actual sin of Sodom? Because this ties into God's statement to Israel about sacrifice. Ezekiel 16:49 through 50. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them, as you have seen. The prophet says the sin of Sodom is not just the detestable things that we think of. Okay, the sin of Sodom is they were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They didn't help the poor and the needy. And right before God makes an anti-sacrificial statement in Isaiah 1:11, he calls them Sodom and Gomorrah. You're just like them. You're uncaring, you're overfed, and you're unconcerned. You're not helping the poor and the widow, but you're bringing these sacrifices and offerings, and you're behaving just like the pagan nations who think it doesn't matter how I treat humanity. All that matters is that I'm giving God his portion of blood for the day, and all is well. And God again says, no. It's not the way this works. All right. Amos 5:21 through 24. I hate, God says. I despise your religious festivals. You know what? I feel the same way sometimes. Not ones like this, though. These are great. I despise your religious festivals. God don't like getting up on Sunday morning either, apparently. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Why? Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Why, God? Why won't you accept the sacrifices? Why? The pagan gods do. Why won't you? Verse 24. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Again, God is saying you're missing the whole point. The whole point is how you treat humanity. Because these are bearers of my image. But you're not doing justice. You're not helping the poor and the needy and the widow. You're not doing that. But you're bringing me endless seas of animal blood. But the only thing I want an endless sea of is justice. Come on now. We have read this warped, twisted, pagan notion of sacrifice right into the gospel, and it has ruined the modern presentation of the gospel. It has become irrelevant, and honestly, it's become sickening. And it's become a factory for creating atheists. The Reformed theological tradition is an atheism factory. Because they look at the message we call the gospel and they say, don't you understand the Bronze Age mythology you're holding to? We're past this. And they're right. The way we've viewed the gospel is nothing but Bronze Age mythology. But thank God that's not actually the gospel. It's just what we've called the gospel. Mark 12, listen to this. One of the teachers of the law, verse 28, one of the teachers of the law came and he heard them debating, and noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment in the law greater than these. Well said, teacher, the man replied. You are right in saying that God is one and that there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. What's revealed here? What's revealed here is that Jesus himself is saying that loving God and loving people is more important than burnt offerings and sacrifices, and that's what God's really into. Now, we could talk about that being a commandment under the law and all that, but we're just not doing that today. Either way, what's revealed is that God's not into burnt offerings and sacrifices. He's into just love me. Just be my son. Let me love you. Love humanity. That's what it's all about. If you want to do my will, love people. All right, let's keep going here. I hope you're getting something out of this. I'm enjoying myself. I hope you are. Okay, Psalm 51, 16 through 17. David speaking in the aftermath of his moral failings with Bathsheba and with the whacking of her husband. He's having a penitent moment here. He's feeling pretty bad about what he's done. And he says, you have, listen to me now, David, old covenant man, beholden to old covenant law, says, you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give you a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. It's not what the law says. It's not what the tradition he comes from says. But in this moment of profound brokenness, in this moment where his heart is opening and he's realizing a truth about himself and about his God, all of a sudden the ridiculousness of the sacrificial system becomes plain to him. And he says, you know what? In this place where I'm at right now, for me to bring you a burnt offering, you wouldn't be pleased with that. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. David realized that the place he was at that point, where he realized that he had done his family wrong and he'd done another man's family, he had done humanity wrong. Him realizing that and him changing what he had done and becoming a lover of humanity once more and a lover of his family once more and a doer of good, that was the sacrifice God wanted. But a burnt offering, he had no interest in. Jeremiah 7, 21 through 24. I'm sure you've heard this before, but this is good. Okay, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat meat. For I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice. What? God says, what? Hold on. Back the trolley up. Jesus, God, Holy Spirit, all of you guys. Get back here. What? You did not command the Israelites regarding burnt offerings and sacrifice. Well, what about Leviticus? Isn't that kind of what that's all about? And yet God says, I did not give them any command regarding burnt offerings and sacrifices. Some will say, oh, he said I didn't do it in the day I brought them out. That just means he didn't do it in that 24-hour window. You know that's not what that means. God says, I did not give them any commandment regarding burnt offerings or sacrifices. What I did say is this, obey my voice and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. Walk in all the ways that I've commanded you, that it may be well with you. Love me, love your neighbor. Boom, there you go. I said nothing about burnt offerings and sacrifices because I'm not a God who needs them. I'm not Molech, I'm not Baal, I'm not Asherah. That's not who I am. I don't need your blood, I don't need your animals. I just want you to love me and love people. That's it. It's really easy. But religion gets it all jacked up and has to make these elaborate rituals. We copy the nations. What I want you to see here is that the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews that Jesus does in fact offer his Father a sacrifice in a sense. But it is not sacrifice in the cultic sense, where an unblemished animal or a human is offered to the God and the God receives it and he's satisfied and pleased and at peace. Because Jesus says, you didn't desire this stuff. I've come to do your will. And he uncouples the will of God from this pagan idea of sacrifice. But then it does say that the will of God was that we would be cleansed once for all through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus. What does that say? That says that what Jesus accomplishes in the body has to do with us, not to do with the Father. It's sacrifice in the sense that he lays his life down to save us from the sin that was destroying us. But not that he's appeasing God or saving you from God. The modern gospel where God saves you from God. You ever seen the little meme where it's Jesus knocking on the door, all Revelations 3 style? And it's like, hey, let me in. They're like, why? So I can save you. From what? From what I will do to you if you don't open the door and let me in. You silly goose. God saves us from God. That's what we've passed off as the gospel for years, but it's not the gospel. Jesus says, yes, there was a sacrifice, but it's not sacrifice the way that you think of sacrifice. The sacrifice was the very thing that you, Israel, always neglected to do in the midst of offering your sacrifices, which was to lay your life down for the weak, was to lay your life down for someone else. That was what God was always after in regard to sacrifice. That is the sacrifice of God. Laying down your life for another, not the offering of blood. That is the actual sacrifice of Jesus, where he lays down his life in service of another, where he lays down his life for those too weak to help themselves, not where he gives himself to God so that God can engorge himself on the dead body of his son and find satisfaction in it. Every time you're tempted to believe that, make yourself think of it in gruesome terms like that and realize who the God is you're worshiping if that's true. It'll cure you real fast. Because I don't want to tell my kids about that God. I don't want to teach my kids that that's okay. I don't want to teach my kids that if you've got something against somebody else, it's okay to go punch someone else in the face so you can forgive the other person. Because that's how real justice works. You know, if I'm mad at you, but I kind of like you at the same time, so I want to get rid of my anger and kind of want to be buds with you, but at the same time, well, I still got that little tension there. What I can do to get rid of that is I can punch you in the face and hurt you, and I can take out on you what I meant for him, and then we can be buds again. That's what the modern gospel says. And that's what you communicate to your children that ultimate goodness looks like when you preach the gospel like this. And those ideas get sewn into our subconscious minds, and they sit there, and they stir, and they stir, and they stir, and they change us into different people. Yeah. So what is the sacrifice of Jesus then? It's the laying down of his life for those too weak to help themselves, not the offering of blood to an angry deity to turn his frown upside down. Let's just a few more passages here and then we'll end, I promise. I hope you're getting something out of this. Think of sacrifice in the sense of a soldier who sacrifices his life to help someone else. We don't see, and even that is maybe taking it too far, and even there's ghastly images involved there too. But think of it in the heroic sense of the word. Think of sacrifice in that sense of the word, where you're laying your life down for someone else, not offering yourself to an angry, deranged deity to make them happy. That was what the sacrifice of Jesus was. He came to establish justice in the earth, but that justice did not look like, and it does not look like, an angry God being fed a sacrificial snack to make him happy. That's not what justice is. It's not making amends with an offended deity. It's doing good for others. Check this out. This is God's definition of justice. Isaiah 42, 3-4. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. So what's Jesus going to do? He's going to faithfully bring forth justice. Well, in our mindset, that means he's going to satisfy the demands of an angry God so he can let humanity off the hook. But what does it actually look like? And the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. Matthew 22, 13-22, the Bible tells us we have this passage fulfilled. And what did the establishing of justice in the earth look like in that instance? It looked like a man with a withered hand being healed. It looked like sick people being made well. That was what Jesus establishing justice in the earth looked like. It looked like him laying down his life in service of others. It looked like him going to the weak and to the poor and to those who were too helpless to help themselves and doing for them what they couldn't do for themselves. And ultimately, it looked like one dying for all and therefore all die. Where he takes down everything that was done in Adam, however you see or understand that. He takes down all of the effects of the fall. and he recreates humanity through resurrection and causes us to be adopted and deified through ascension, that is, my friend, the sacrifice of Jesus. Not turning an offended God's frown upside down, but laying down his life in service of others. See, when we see it the other way around, and we preach sacrifice as what Jesus did to change God, we don't know we're doing it, but we're buying into the very pagan myth that Israel was rebuked for time and again throughout the Old Testament. Yeah. That you think it's okay to treat humanity, whatever, coldness, doesn't matter how I treat my wife, doesn't matter how I treat the poor, that doesn't matter. What matters is that there's blood on that altar. And if there's blood on that altar, then God is happy. Even the modern grace message will say it doesn't matter how you treat humanity. What matters is that there's blood on that altar. And so God is happy, and God's cool because somebody was murdered. But I can treat my wife however I want, and as long as I'm in my Jesus suit, it doesn't even look like I did it to God. It's okay. So I can get away with it. That is a selfish form of grace. That is a reaction to a self-centered, the whole idea that I'm just an individual, and the problem of sin is just an individual problem, and I need my individual sins to be washed away so that I, as an individual, can get on good terms with God again. That's the message we start with. And then, of course, we strain it through legalism, and it becomes this horrendous mess. But we start off with this idea of it's a selfish message. When we get over it and we come into grace, we bring that same selfishness into the message of grace. And now, instead of it all being about my personal sin and my personal issues, now it's all about my personal freedom and liberty. And so it doesn't matter. I'm free to do whatever I want, even if it offends you. I'm free to do it. But actually, Paul said the opposite, didn't he? He's like, I'm free to do whatever the heck I want to do. But if it makes my brother stumble, I'll never do it. Right? But the reaction to the selfish gospel that we've preached for years about personal sin and personal, connection between God being broken, we react to that with this selfish grace. Okay? And I do think there is a great, people, I've never actually heard hyper grace being preached or anything, all that kind of stuff we say. I have. I've heard it. And it's just a selfish message. Okay? It's not actually biblical grace anyway, so I don't have a problem with calling it what it is because it's not biblical grace. I remember I did something on Facebook about marriage and just treating your wife respectfully or something like that a couple months back, and I couldn't believe the responses I got from people who were like, I'm under grace, not under law. I can do whatever I want. I can go out on my wife if I want. I can be with whomever I want to be with, and God still loves me. And I was like, are you kidding me, you bunch of jokers? That's grace to you? That's grace to you? No. You think because there's blood on an altar, you can do what you want to humanity. God says it doesn't matter what blood's on what altar. Okay? My sacrifice was to give you an example of what other-centered, self-giving love looks like. So that you can give it to others. That's the sacrifice of God. That's what it really looks like. My friend, I got to shut up. I got to end. I don't know how long I've actually been going, but it feels like I've been going for a really long time. So we are going to wind this down. You guys want to get out of here. I want a nap. You all want naps, so I won't hold you much longer. But let me just say this. We are not the servants of some God up in the sky who once hated us. And the only way we could go from being abhorred to adored was for him to become a man and have himself be murdered to appease his anger. That's not God. God is not a God that you can spill a little blood on an altar and treat humanity how you... That's not justice. That's not how God works. That's not what real sacrifice looks like. That is what pagan, idolatrous sacrifice looks like. But the sacrifices of God, they're a broken, contrite spirit. It's laying down your life for others. It's doing for others what they can't do for themselves. Oh yeah, I can't let you go without reading this to you. Because this is where it all caps off. Okay, listen to this, and I'm going to end with this. I promise. Yeah. On my love for my wife, I promise. No. Hebrews 12:3 says, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. Consider him. Look at the hostility he endured from sinners. Not from God against himself, but from sinners. Consider that. Why? Because this same group of people was under intense persecution, and so what he did was a model for them. Look at what he did. Look how he willingly laid down his life for others, and understand that you're going to have to mirror that. Luke 23:33-34, we have Jesus in the midst of being murdered by people he exhaled into existence. All he can give is forgiveness. Father, forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing. Okay? He offers them grace and mercy in the midst of all of that nonsense and all of that junk, giving us an example of what real sacrifice looks like. Laying down your life for another, not getting angry at people who are treating you like garbage in the midst of a situation and thinking you can return the favor and just know that because there's blood on an altar, you're okay for doing it. No. That's not what sacrifice is. That's not what it's all about. It's about loving the unlovable, about loving the people that you want to hate. Even when they're crucifying you, all you can give them is forgiveness and grace and love and mercy. Now, listen to this. 1 John 3:16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we therefore ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. It doesn't say Jesus laid down his life for us, and therefore we're free to do whatever we want to our brothers and sisters because there's sacrificial blood on an altar somewhere. It says he lays down his life. He endures hostility from sinners against himself, and all he can do is forgive. And we know what love is. It's revealed through this act. He laid down his life for us so that we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters, even when they're crucifying us, even when they're treating us hostilely. We lay down our lives in sacrifice. Check this out. Hebrews 13:15-16. Through him, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Even in the New Testament, sacrifice is revealed to be about laying down your life for someone else. 1 Peter 2:5 talks about us being a house of living stones that are offering spiritual sacrifices up to God. What are those spiritual sacrifices we're offering up to God? Do good for others. Don't neglect the poor. Love each other. Treat humanity well. Treat them like who they really are. Sons and daughters who bear their daddy's image. Romans 12:1, I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Anyways, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is this, is that God advances us in our understanding of sacrifice. We start with human sacrifice, then he takes us through, he allows animal sacrifice for a season to wean us off of that principle, and then he shows us this is what sacrifice actually looks like. It looks like one person laying down their life for those who are too weak to help themselves. And I'm redoing this whole thing. I'm reestablishing what sacrifice is really all about. From now on, no more animal blood. I don't want it. I'm done with it. I told you in the past I didn't want it, but I let you do it because that was the way you worked. No more. This is what it really looks like. You want to know what I'm into? You want to know what I like? Love humanity. Look in their eyes and see my eyes. Look at them, and even when you hate them, remember whose image they bear. And love them and do good for them. Those are the sacrifices that please me. Blood on an altar somewhere? Give me a break. The blood of his son is precious to him because of what it means. It meant that his son was willing to lay down his life for others in sacrifice, not that he was a blood sacrifice that appeased his anger. It's precious to him because he obeyed and laid down his life for others, and therefore it's precious because it's a selfless, or more not selfless, but a self-giving act. That's sacrifice. So there's a whole lot more we could talk about, and we're not going to be able to talk about it today. If you get my book, I got like 5 big, huge chapters on that in there. That's why the book is 400 pages, and we talk about that a little bit more and a little bit more in detail. But what I want to leave you with today is this. You are not the servants of a God who once hated you, but was forced to love you because a human sacrifice, it was his anselmic antidepressant, his little sacrificial snack he was fed that made him happy and made him favorably disposed towards you once more. That's not who God is. That's not who he ever was. Who God always is and who God always was is revealed through the actual sacrifice of Jesus, which is the laying down of his life on your behalf because he loves you. And the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and that Son is the perfect representation of the Father, and it therefore reveals to us who God really is. He's a servant of humanity. And when we realize who he is, we're empowered to be the same. But this other system of sacrifice, it encourages selfishness, it encourages self-centeredness, and it makes us look like the opposite of who the Godhead really is. That's right. So we need to reorder, we need to change and transform our understanding even of what the gospel is, because we've been presenting a pagan message. And we've been name dropping Jesus in the midst of it. But it's not doing us a whole lot of good. Your Father loves you, and he always has. He didn't need blood to be convinced. He's always been laying down his life for you. But he revealed it in a way that cannot be missed by becoming a human being and literally, physically laying down his life to forever burn that image into our minds of a God who is a servant, of a God who is on the side of humanity and loves them fiercely.